Okay, so the EnComPaSS project, it stands for Enhanced Community Palliative Support Services. And the technology is actually being brought over to the UK. This is the first pilot site of the technology that's been used in Canada, the US, and in Europe. But the first application to palliative services and the first use in the UK. So this is very much as kind of a pilot evaluation of a single case implementation here at St Luke's. So just to describe the technology very quickly. So the traditional model of delivery would be one nurse in the community dealing with one patient at a time. But what the E-shift model, as it's called in Canada, was set up to do was to have a delegating nurse here at the top, a senior member of staff, and then delegating down to more junior members of staff who can then scale up the service and create a more efficient, cost-effective and scalable service. So it's a phone app or something you can use on your laptop to, when you're out in the community, collect data in real time. That gets transmitted back to the person who's back at base, who's delegating and overseeing all of the activity that's going on. So it's real-time data collection, delegation, and coordination of community services. But the implementation here at St Luke's is fundamentally not a technology project. So it's all about culture change, business transformation. It's a really complex intervention that involves lots of different aspects, but using the technology as an enabler to manage other changes within the service. So as I said, it's a complex intervention. Any type of technology intervention into health service delivery does tend to be complex in nature, so it tends to be non-linear. So any inputs you put into it, you don't necessarily get a standard amount of outcomes from that. There can be tipping points, feedback loops. There can be certain emergent properties that you weren't expected. There's dynamic processes that happen. So one change in one part of the system can change other parts of the system, and there can be feedback loops between those changes. There's lots of adaptation that normally goes on, so the ideas about how things are going to be delivered and designed at the start are quite often very different to how they end up being used. And there's lots of uncertainty and co-evolution as well of development of the project. And I know during the evaluation I've been feeding back interim findings and so on, which have also influenced the delivery design and development. So we're concentrating really on three main aspects of the project. So looking at broader economic outcomes, the organisational development, so how's it being implemented, very much with a mind on scaling up and spreading. If other people were going to use this technology in this way, what are the key things that they would need to know? And importantly as well, looking at changes to patient experiences. So the design of the evaluation was a theory-led approach. So this is a way of looking at one particular intervention without any controls or anything, and looking at trying to understand what the causal links are between the inputs and the outcomes by developing theory and refining and testing the theory about why things are working and who they're working for and why. So it was based on an approach called realist evaluation, which I won't go into in too much detail, but basically it relies on putting together theories around context, mechanism, outcome, conjectures. So the context is very much looking at the functionality of the technology, what's it actually doing, how's it changing the way that people are working and so on, and also looking at how it's being implemented in the organisation. And they will then allow certain behaviour changes and new ways of working. So these are the mechanisms, and then potentially lead to outcomes. So different patterns of admissions, different patterns of discharge, and potentially efficiency outcomes. So not looking at one key outcome, but looking at patterns of outcomes and potentially patterns of outcomes for different people as well. So these 5 stages here are kind of a linear progression, if you like, of the evaluation process. So we started off with initial theory development. So looking at what we're expecting really around these context, mechanism, outcome conjectures. So if we're going to change the context in this way, how's that going to change behaviour and working practices, and what sort of outcomes can we expect? It was all very speculative at the early stages. And we put in place a selection of measures and monitoring processes to look at these changes in context, mechanisms, and outcomes. Some were longitudinal, some were planned as looking at it pre-post, pre-intervention and after the intervention, and a range of mixed methods of qualitative and quantitative methods. Stage 3 has been quite a long period of theory monitoring, testing and refinement. Are things happening how we expect them? Are we kind of moving through from one stage to the other? Is context changing how we expect it? Is that changing behaviour and practices and so on? And then into a process of sense checking and validation, which just concluded this summer. And then the next stage really is pulling all of this together and describing the outcomes within a kind of a rational framework of the changing contexts and the organisational and behaviour changes. So there's quite a few people in the room have seen some of these slides before, but there is some new stuff in there, you'll be glad to hear, because 2 days ago I got some the last lot of data from the Acute Trust looking at admissions, which is very interesting, and done some analysis of the last load of interviews that we did towards the end of the summer as well. So I'll be presenting some of that. So data collection, let's say lots of different methods. So meetings and informal discussions, particularly at the start, to try and get the early theories together. A whole raft of interviews at different phases. Acute care data, data from hospice, and observations of patient visits. Staff using paperwork, and how that kind of translated into computer use as well. Observation of board rounds and multidisciplinary team meetings to look at the whole organisation and how things were actually changing over time. So there were quite a few kind of key benefit assumptions around the programme. One of these was around more appropriate hospital admissions, and some of the early thinking around this was if we had improved monitoring of vital signs, regular assessments of family ability to cope, improved care planning, more efficient working practices, these kinds of things, we might see more appropriate hospital admissions, so less blue lights to emergency departments and more kind of thoughtful, planned admissions. Another benefit assumption was reduced travel costs and more visits per day. So the assumption here that it was mobile access to patients' records, streamlining administration practices, so that people wouldn't necessarily have to return back to the hospice when they're out in the community. They can have access to patient data out in the community. Less need to come to the hospice at the start of the day and return at the end of the day, and reducing travel and having more visits. I'll come back to that in a while. Another benefit assumption, key benefit assumption, was streamlining the multidisciplinary team meetings. So conversion of paper records to electronic records, and reviewing and reorganisation of the multidisciplinary team meetings in light of the new data available, new processes of working, and so on. And the key efficiency gain was here just really to reduce the length and the frequency of the MDT meetings. And another one was the remote support of lower band staff. So this is kind of scaling up capability really. So the remote supervision and delegation of tasks to reduce the number of senior nurse and medical face-to-face patient contacts required, joint visits and so on. So really changing the kind of the profile of the grades of staff who are performing the work in the community. Okay, so this was this is more sort of interim findings that I'm going to present now. So you see, it wasn't a clear cut, you know, we're doing the old thing now and, you know, tomorrow we're going to start doing the new thing. It's, this kind of technology implementation and service redesign takes time, and there are lots of different elements to it. It wasn't just the technology introduction, there were also changes that were planned around service reorganisation in the hospice as well, and you know, various other things as well. But it all kind of joined together and became codependent. So you see, there was a funding awarded. So as part of my role as lead evaluator at the NHR clerk for Yorkshire and Humber, we managed to secure some funding from the Nursing Technology Fund of £250,000 to implement the technology. So that was awarded in February 2015. There was a long period of implementation and preparation and getting all the tech ready. There was systematic recording of EnComPaSS, began on paper and then transferred onto the real-time data collection. New MDT meeting structure happened, and that was introduced. And then there's a small-scale implementation with 4 nurses, and then in March 2016, the fully live system came into play. So you see, here's the data that we got from the Acute Trust, ×1 and ×2, and you see that it really covers that implementation time. So it's not just pre-post. We've got quite a bit in the time where it's fully live, but most of it is that interim period. But we did find some really interesting findings. So this is looking at the hospital admissions in Sheffield teaching hospitals, at the various hospitals. So hospice patients, there were less of them, but there was a lot less actually admitted to hospital. Total admissions went down. The admissions per patient went down by almost 3/4 of an admission. Length of stay went down by almost 1/4 of a day. So when we add all these up into total hospital time, there's 8,893 days saved over the 2 time periods. So there's lots of assumptions around this, but you know, if we try and translate that into economic terms, there's a proportional time saving for the 1,156 patients in the second time series, accounting for about 6,500 days. So if we assume that the admissions accepted by the service remain static, and all of the acute admissions are to bed-based services, so at the cost of specialist palliative care of £371 a bed day, that comes out as a potential saving of 2,400,000 a year. When we put that against the costs of implementation, we have the 250,000 that was put into to put the system in place, but it's very difficult to calculate. It was a pilot project. There was lots of software development that was going on at the time. The Sensory Technologies themselves invested a lot in this as a UK demonstration site. There were lots of concurrent staffing and organisational developments. Very, very complex to get all of those costs to put against those benefits. But if we do just look at the £250,000 Nursing Technology Fund input to deliver the programme, looks at a 1-year return ratio of 1 to 9.7, so nearly a 1 to 10 return rate, which I think is pretty, talking to the people at Nursing Technology Fund, it's pretty unprecedented. They're very happy with that, needless to say. So how does it fit with the various theories that we had, those assumptions, those early assumptions? So these findings simply support the theory that improved care is resulting in reduced and more appropriate hospital admissions. So you see the top box there, we've got these presentations to emergency are down by 2.6, and the admissions to other services up by 2.6% of the whole during those times. Interestingly, though, you'll see that in the bottom we've got Northern General Hospital, Western Park Hospital, which is a cancer specialist facility, and the Royal Hallamshire. So the Northern General is a general hospital with an emergency department, and the admissions of hospice patients was down 4.2%. But we had an increase as well to patients going to Western Park. So indicating that, you know, we're getting less people going to facilities with the emergency services and more kind of better organised, if you like. So they're going to where they should be going. So the theory around improved community support and case management, allowing more patients to be discharged to their own home after a hospital episode. So there was a change of discharges to usual place of residence or own home, up by 3.2%, and admitted to hospital becoming a lodged patient was down by 3.1%. So there's a change there. And changes to visit types. So, I mean, the whole design of the technology is to enable that delegation, that change in the bands of staff that they're able to deliver care. And you'll see here in the first time period, there was no Band 5 nurse visits because there weren't any Band 5 nurses. It just wasn't possible within the way that the service was structured. But then in the second time period, we've got an increase, 286 Band 5 visits. But you see also, importantly, the consultant joint visits are down, consultant visits are down, nurse joint visits down. So, you know, it's definitely having an impact on the type of visits that are happening in the community. So reducing the need to return to the office in the afternoon to complete paperwork. So the idea was that visits would be spread more evenly over the course of the day and there might be more visits. That assumption looks incorrect at present. There's a small shift towards some earlier visits, but have a look at some of the qualitative data that kind of suggests that there are important changes going on here. It's not in the numbers, it's in the way of delivery and organisation coordination. So some key themes from the final qualitative data. So there's joint interviews with 13 members of staff, senior management, nurses, rapid response team, technicians, admin staff, so on here at the hospice. You see, there's, you always get this with technology implementation in health services. The key thing there, so we've got 20 comments talking about the incompatibility of systems. Which is something that you know is an ongoing issue, and it always is in health service delivery. But we've got some really interesting you know contextual data about what the issues are and how to overcome them, and how things have actually you know really improved and had workarounds and so on. But I'm going to concentrate on some of these actually that relate to some of the data that relates to the initial theories and how they've changed. So I mean, initially when we were developing the theories, a lot of it is all about kind of surface level change, really kind of changing functions, but within the same organisational structure, the same kind of delivery. So trying to imagine what things would be like with the technology. There wasn't really the depth of thinking about how the organisational structure and service delivery might change, which we now have. So oversight and real-time joint decision-making has turned out to be one of the really key elements of change. So here's some quotes. So we've got a few slides here with some quotes. I'm just going to read them out because that would look a real better way of doing it. So I think the biggest flexibility has come with the delegation role, being able to see where people are and what people are doing. It's a bit like having a ward out in the community now, and we're making sure the right person's there at the right time, and that can change during the working shift. I think it could be misleading because if you tick a 4, the delegator will pick up at it and go, oh, what are you going to do about that? And this is really interesting. There was a bit of a complaint saying, oh, sometimes we get picked up on things, we know what's happening and we're okay dealing with it. And, people might have, show that there's been some sudden decline in the health or so on. But it's getting picked up by the delegator, and that's a little bit annoying. But it shows that it's working. It shows that things are getting picked up on. And there's lots of positives to that. So it does flag up high scores, and you can sort of say, what are you doing about this? But 9 times out of 10 with our team, we say, I'm already on it. Yes, that came up yesterday in terms of instances where the person delegated noticed things happening, absolutely, and being able to know, intervene, or at least monitor the process. So being able to see things in real time happening out with the staff in the community, and being able to monitor that and get in touch with the member of staff and see if there's any more information or anything else needs to be done. The fact that it comes in live means that the actual delegator can say, I need more detail, and then they can get the detail then, and that gives the delegator and clinician the confidence, because it's documented and it's consistently assessed, to actually give an intervention, advice or investigation, advice or escalation advice in a way that couldn't happen if the patient was at home and then you had to come back and wait for a week's MDT, get the notes out and then go through it all again. It literally is converting a 2 or 3 week process into a process that takes minutes, and that has to have a profound effect. So this is leading now into changes in the MDT process. I'll quickly cover in a moment. So is testing out the theories about the more appropriate admissions. So issue could probably play a role in more appropriate admissions, like my lady on Friday who was a urology patient, or going straight into the Macmillan unit rather than the front door of the hospital, A&E or medical admissions, I suppose possibly due to talking things through with a delegating clinician. If you're trying to stabilise a patient or trying to gather more information about somebody that's acutely unwell, and you can ping that right back to somebody back here who can then phone the MAC unit or the nurse practitioner at Weston Park. So having that link in, having somebody who's based in the hospice who can actually do that work and look at what might be the most appropriate course of action for particular patients. I'm going to flick through some of these because I want to leave some time for panel discussion. Travel and coordination. So I said, we haven't seen much shift in the numbers, but the shift has been in the way that things are actually happening. So most people are flexible to be able to say, yes, if it's an urgent problem, to go back out again. But if you can spot them before they're physically back, that's going to be more efficient. So it's happened a couple of times. Well, I did another visit yesterday, just by chance she was on the same street, but didn't have the notes with her. But she had E-shift, so there was enough for her to be going on there. So I think that's from where an efficiency point of view, you see some improvement. So if we can see in the day that there are patients in that area to be visited, and it works for him, he can go straight out from home there. So this is the staff talking about a member of staff who wasn't actually there, but someone who goes out from their own home, takes their laptop or phone out in the morning without coming back. So I think the biggest flexibility has come with the delegation role, being able to see where people are, what people are doing in situations like happened yesterday with X. X arrived at a patient's home and they weren't in or couldn't get hold of them, already made a bit of a backup plan, hadn't you? Well, I had to take something off the next day, so I was able to put them in. So you could just do that. I mean, did you take your paper notes out anyway? No, I did it from E-shift. So, this is giving more flexibility, so being able to kind of in real time just change the way that visits are happening, who's being visited and who's actually making that visit. Probably the biggest development has been workforce development, and this is something that I think a lot of us hadn't really anticipated the impact it was going to have. So there was no way of previously having band 5s on at the weekend. But this bottom point, I think the skill level is higher because they're getting more skilled, the team more challenged because through the MDT process, every new patient's been discussed, all the patients in routine are coming back and being discussed again, and their plans are being monitored. So what we never thought would happen was acceleration of nurses' inductions because of E-shift with the band 5, because they have a delegating clinician supporting them from the minute they set foot in the patient's home. Their working knowledge escalates at such a rapid pace because they've got a senior person with them all the time they're out. They're out visiting far sooner than they would have been because they would have been working alongside a senior nurse, supernumerary for however long, sometimes as long as 3 months. So you see how being in real-time communication with a senior member of staff can really accelerate induction, but also up the skill levels of the staff out in the community without having to wait for those multidisciplinary team meetings to have those discussions. You know, those discussions are happening all the time. So talk about the MDT meetings. It was a Jack and Ori story when I first started here. It was nice because as somebody new to palliative care, I learned a lot in those MDTs from hearing about people's experiences. We all sat down as a group and we listened to everybody's treatment plans, and one patient would be discussed at length for a long time, but that's not efficient for us all to be down there. Whereas now we come down one at a time, just look at the patient so we can get through it. I think the fundamental difference is that what eShift does, it makes every contact that involves more than one professional a multidisciplinary team meeting. So it's allowed it's not just the efficiency saving in streamlining the MDTs, making them shorter, it's actually changed the way that the MDTs work, in that there isn't a necessity to cover all of that information because that's being covered on a day-to-day basis with those contacts and interactions with the senior staff. Okay, so in summary, I think there's been some fundamental changes to service delivery and organisation. Some of the key changes, so the Band 5 nurses, scaling up the delivery and weekend cover, having that real-time decision-making, constant monitoring of visits, the quality assurance, rapid learning, multidisciplinary and senior support, enhanced skill levels, and the MDT meetings now becoming a more systematic process and supported by the ongoing delegation. And having access to patient information, giving flexibility of how people are working in the community, and added coordination of visits has been some of the key changes. So not these kind of surface level things that we were thinking about before, it's been like a really fundamental change in the way that the work's being done. And here's some of the new data that I just got 2 days ago. It might look like I haven't slept for a couple of days. Just got this in a couple of days ago. So this is going past that transitional period. We're now looking at a period covering 3 years that covers the pre-implementation, the intervening implementation time, and then post-implementation. So the line there is when, on that diagram before, showing when the system went fully live. These are this is the mean of emergency department presentations as a percentage of all acute presentations. For about nearly 19,000 hospice staff, and you see there's quite a marked decline there. So if we map that onto the implementation, you see that big decline happens around the time that the new MDT meeting structure comes into play. You see the systematic recording of IPOS was happening before on paper, and there's a bit of a peak there as well while that's happening. But I think with the paper records, they weren't being used in the same way as they were once the system went live. Once the system went live, the IPOS scores, the outcome measures that were being done in the home were being seen live at that point by delegating nurse, by the members of the team, and allowing this, real-time response to what's going on, which probably explains that. So the orange bit there was the pilot implementation with the 4 nurses, and the red is the fully live system. So it's almost too good to be true, really. I've looked at this a few times, and it's showing a good picture, but there's lots more work to be done on that data. So thank you very much.